Um, so I suppose, we're in a situation where things are rapidly escalating, aren't they? When we talked about this discussion, talking about, NATO and the splits going on and all that sort of stuff. At that time, there were sort of threats about a war on Iran, but here we are, like right in the middle of it. So, but I am going to focus on, what we sort of what we wanted to talk about. But obviously, I will be bringing in, the latest situation in relation to Iran. So, we know that there have been very kind of big public political splits in NATO, certainly in relation to Trump's kind of threats against other members and other sort of NATO member states, particularly Canada and Greenland. It was absolutely clear, like why, Canada and Greenland, it was sort of part of Trump's plans for sort of, US expansionism. So early on in his presidency in 2025, Trump threatened to annex Canada, basically saying that Canada should be like, the 51st state of the US. And I think that it's very interesting the kind of the response that we saw from Mark Carney, the Canadian Prime Minister, at Davos quite recently, where he kind of talked about quite candidly about the fact that, this whole idea of a rule-based order is just not true. It doesn't exist. Or, there are rules for the US and for their allies. There are rules for US enemies, and only the US can break those rules. And so, what Carney was saying is that, really this is a farce. But what this rules-based order does mean is it's a subordination to the United States. So really kind of powerful challenge really to the US. And so he was sort of calling for, so-called middle powers, to work together to sort of counter the rise of hard power and sort of great power rivalry. That's kind of how he was putting it. So, to some extent, he was kind of challenging this kind of, a world order in which the sort of the US is like the dominant power, or is trying to attempt to maintain its dominance in the world. Um, and then in January, we had the situation where Trump had already kind of threatened Greenland, but this was made much more sort of explicit. And I think because we had already had the absolute, very real military attack on Venezuela and the absolutely shocking, kidnapping of the elected president of Venezuela. I think, Trump's then sort of threats against Greenland obviously felt a lot more real, didn't it? You know what I mean? Trump has just done this. Is he really going to do the same to Greenland now? And obviously, Greenland is, an autonomous territory within the NATO state of Denmark. So, this was, a definite kind of attack on another NATO state. So, Trump had sort of made clear he wanted to own Greenland. He wanted to totally take over Greenland, and that was to control and exploit, Greenland's natural resources for US profit, but also to control, the new trade routes, shipping routes that were opening up because of the catastrophic climate breakdown, all the sort of the melting ice caps. But not only that, it was also in terms of US military dominance, and it still is. So, this whole issue around like why was sort of, having sovereignty of Greenland so important. It's so that the US can't be stopped from doing whatever it wants to do militarily in that region. So we know that Trump wants to have sovereignty over the area around the military base. The like, can I pronounce this right? Pitofik. Pitifik, I think is how you pronounce that. So he wants to, expand the US kind of military power in the Arctic. We know that this base, Pitifik, is a powerful tracking and detection radar for the US national missile defense. So we have long been campaigning against national missile defense because we know that this is something that the US has been developing since Reagan. You know what I mean? This is like been a long, long project. And this is all about kind of the US having nuclear dominance. Whilst we see films like House of Dynamite, where you kind of see the US missile defense in a kind of defensive way. You've got these kind of missiles coming into the US. Can they shoot them down? Oh no, they can't. Nuclear sort of annihilation. But it's also it means that the US can have potentially it can have nuclear preeminence in that it can shoot down countries that are trying to defend itself from a nuclear attack. So that's the other side of it, which is partly why missile defense is so dangerous and why it's kind of sort of precipitating this sort of new nuclear arms race. So that's why Greenland and and all the sort of the tension around that's what's kind of going on there. Now, Britain and European NATO states, and Canada all came out condemning Trump, didn't they? Defending kind of Greenland's sovereignty. And you had this sort of extraordinary situation where kind of NATO countries, France, Germany, Sweden, Norway, Finland, the Netherlands, and the UK all deployed, very small numbers, but, deployed troops to Greenland. So it's like, why are they doing this? Are they doing this on Trump's wishes? Because Trump's was arguing, that Greenland is totally incapable of being able to defend this very strategically important area against threats from China, and Russia. Or were they defending Greenland from Trump? That's the kind of situation that we were in. So, I mean, certainly it's clear that Starmer thought it was the former, and made it absolutely clear, we're sending troops there to kind of bolster, the military presence against Russia and China. But clearly, Trump thought that it was the latter, thought that it was a defiance against kind of him and threatened to increase, tariffs on America. So you really have this sort of situation of like a kind of exposing of this very kind of brutal, venal kind of self-interest of Trump's sort of America first agenda, and that's not is not new. Like US policy has been that they have been negotiating with Denmark for decades around wanting to get hold of Greenland. But I think this is now where the gloves are off, aren't they? The way that kind of Trump articulates himself is this is all about like a kind of colonialist sort of expansionist sort of project. It's not about what's in the interest of like any other country, and certainly like it's only a very narrow section that Trump is representing in terms of the US. So we're sort of seeing this kind of like it's all stick and no carrot. And I think that it means that this very kind of militarily aggressive, economically coercive sort of approach of Trump means that it has been creating these kind of cracks in sort of the US alliance. And I think this sort of the issue around NATO that definitely made that really, really clear. But that's not to say that NATO's not as militarily powerful as it ever was. It clearly is, still the most powerful nuclear alliance in the world, and we now have a situation where you've got these new nuclear bombs stationed across Europe, and you've got like NATO states are massively increasing their military spending. So it's a very kind of contradictory situation. But I think that certainly for countries that are kind of absolute kind of key US allies, it has been particularly challenging. And it's been particularly challenging here in Britain when, Britain is so integrated kind of militarily into into the sort of the US war machine, as it were. And we've definitely seen like far greater challenges to this so-called special relationship. There's been lots in the media now and sort of, political sort of discourse exposing Britain's nuclear dependency on the US. There's this whole thing about the fact that like, well, Starmer's not standing up to Trump on the tariffs because, we have to lease our Trident missiles from the US. So we wouldn't be able to use our nuclear weapons if it wasn't for the US. So this was being openly discussed in the media, and kind of politically. And I think, even more so now we're seeing in terms of Starmer's, like disastrous decision to give in to Trump and allow, British bases to be used in military action against Iran. Sort of trying to justify this legally by saying that Britain is only going to be involved in sort of defensive actions, but I think there is a kind of growing concern amongst sort of military experts, but also, diplomats like, former British ambassador to Iran, is concerned that Britain could be kind of getting drawn into, you know, civil war in Iran, a potentially kind of open-ended, very, very sort of chaotic, regional war across the Middle East. So, very, very dangerous. And, I think what we're seeing unfolding is incredibly just it's sort of catastrophic, isn't it? It's absolutely sort of horrifying what we're seeing in terms of what's really unprovoked illegal attack from CND's point of view. This has been presented very similarly in really to the Iraq war. We remember that this was all about, Iraq having weapons of mass destruction, wasn't it? This was a justification, for why we had to go to war. What Trump was sort of doing, he was sort of, flipping from one justification to another, but certainly, a central one was around Iran posing a nuclear threat, that Iran was intent on developing nuclear weapons, despite the fact that Israel and the US had bombed Iran's nuclear facilities, last year and, destroyed them, annihilated them as Trump had said. It was clear from mediators like the Omani foreign minister that Iran was negotiating in good faith. That Iran had agreed to sort of zero enrichment of its uranium, that it was, had agreed that it would not stockpile enriched uranium, and that it also had agreed to full verification of its nuclear facilities by the International Atomic Energy Agency. But despite that, and despite the fact that peace was supposedly within our reach, Israel bombed Iran. And I think that we've now sort of seen, I think, sort of further the sort of the shifting of the sort of justifications for the US. People, I'm sure heard like Rubio's statements that the US knew Israel was going to attack Iran, and so therefore, it was like, therefore, we had to attack Iran because we were going to get attacked. I mean, absolutely clear that there was, that Iran was not a threat to the US, and there's been kind of overwhelming, sort of legal body of opinion supporting that. I think, it's been absolutely clear that this is about securing regime change. Absolutely sort of, you've seen these really horrific statements now. I mean, having the US, clearly assassinated Iran's supreme leader. We've now had statements from Israel saying that it will assassinate any new Iranian leader. I think again shows us that this is clearly about regime change. And as I say, this is the US kind of rules-based order, isn't it? So where do we go from here in this very, very kind of dangerous time? Well, certainly, CND has been sort of turning around this. We've come out very strongly condemning it, but also really highlighting the lies in relation to sort of nuclear threats, but also the nuclear hypocrisy. You know, there is a country in the Middle East that does have nuclear weapons. That's Israel, and it's totally failed to, sign up to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. It won't let any inspectors into its nuclear facilities. And yet, here we have a situation where, Iran has negotiated in good faith, and it's just been illegally attacked. But also, I think we are working really hard to show unfortunately, the complicity of the British government in this, in terms of the use of British bases, because certainly in the build up to a military attack, we work very closely with Nuke Watch, which I'm sure a lot of you know about. These really, really tireless plane spotters, not just plane spotting. I mean, they're properly sort of following, what's going on globally, aren't they? Sort of tracking all these kind of flight paths. But they were saying to us, there is, jets are coming out of Lakenheath. They're flying to Jordan. We know that kind of refueling tankers were sort of coming into Mildenhall. There was clearly lots and lots of activity going on, and it was really clear to them that it was all building up to an attack on Iran. So we've been highlighting that to say, yes, okay, Starmer's been pushing back on rightly pushing back on giving permission to Diego Garcia and to Fairford, but what about these other bases? Where there clearly has been activity kind of going on there. So to sort of highlight that. But then let's look at what sort of public opinion like on this. And I think that it's really interesting because if we remember back in January when there was this big threat around Greenland, and Zach Polanski came out with this, I thought, like really excellent response, and sort of saying, well, Britain should say we're going to close down US bases if the US attacks Greenland. And public opinion showed that like 55% of the population totally supported that. They are definitely not in favour of this US special relationship. And now in relation to Iran, 49% of the population oppose the use of British bases by the US for attacking Iran, compared to 28%. So I think that's, very interesting. Very different countries. I think, probably very different kind of attitudes towards Greenland than Iran, but very sort of similar opposition there too. So I think that, in relation to like, are the days of NATO numbered? I would say not. And I think there's a real attempt to kind of rehabilitate NATO. People might have seen at the Munich Security Conference a couple of weeks ago, there was a real attempt by like JD Vance to position the US and Europe as an alliance, a kind of empire, a colonialist sort of like entity that should be reasserting itself over the global south, like really in those kind of terms. And I think that they to some extent are kind of getting what they want, aren't they? Certainly it's not just Britain that's come behind Trump now, but certainly kind of the European countries have too. But I think what is different is that none of those countries, and certainly including Britain, were prepared to support this kind of illegal unprovoked attack. They're now sort of saying that they will come behind what can, legally they think can be positioned as a sort of a defensive support. And I think that we have to recognize, why is that? And that's because I think it's because of Iraq. But I also think it's because of the huge kind of movement, Palestine movement, against Israel's genocide. And I think it is also, as I say, the role that Trump is playing in the world is that people are recognizing that being part of an alliance, military alliance with the US, is is very, very dangerous for us. It's dragging us into, more and more kind of reckless, wars, and people don't want to go along with that. So I think that's why that's happened, and I think that it's very significant. So yes, so what are we doing? So as I say, politically, CND is like totally centrally involved in this. We are calling this emergency demonstration on Saturday. We're supporting the demonstration at RAF Fairford, but I just want to say the sort of the demonstration in London is quite significant in that initially it was called by CND and Stop the War, but now all the partners in the Palestine coalition have now come in behind that, which I think is very significant. We're now working to really see how we can get the trade unions much more heavily involved, because I think people have seen the statement by the TUC very sort of strongly condemning the sort of the illegal attacks on Iran, but also quite significantly, coming out and saying, we need to be getting behind the TPNW, the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which is, a big sort of step forward. So, there are definitely big shifts going on. And I think, and I'll finish here, that I think, in terms of what's happening with the trade union movement, again, I think that's a lot to do with the incredible movement against the genocide of the Palestinian people, and making the explicit links between the arms companies, and the literally sort of the factories and the arms companies that are making profit out of genocide, and how that has become something that the trade union movement cannot tolerate, it cannot support. And so that's why you got this very significant vote at the TUC last year, where they overturned some, pretty kind of reactionary policy before, which was massively in favor of increasing military spending and wanting a 30-year pipeline for nuclear contracts. That was a position previously that got overturned to be one where it was like, we need to be spending our money on public services, on increasing wages, on improving living standards, not on weapons of war. And I think that this is another development around that, the fact that the trade union movement has come in so strongly against this attack on Iran. So yeah, so we're all out for the demonstration on Saturday. It's great that you're going to be going to Fairford. I think that's really, really important. As I say, I think that the significance around people having a greater understanding and awareness about the military presence of US bases in Britain, I think is really important. It's really important in terms of our campaigning against US nuclear weapons at Lakenheath. So I would just add to your diary that on the 4th of April, there's going to be a peace camp at Lakenheath again, but we're really pushing for the 4th of April. It's Saturday, the 4th of April. There's going to be another blockade there. So we're really encouraging people to kind of go up there and support that, because we have to be kind of taking the sort of the protests to these bases to sort of shine a spotlight on them. And I think, finally, that this kind of the horrific role that Trump is playing, and the challenging of Britain's kind of special relationship, means that there's much more space opening up for a debate about the need for an independent foreign policy. This isn't just me saying this is like Labour MPs, there's like lots of sort of discussion about why we need this now. We need to kind of break the link from Trump, and and I think that's very, very important for us. And it'd be really great to talk about like what's possible in terms of being able to organize a public meeting or a debate, even with like I don't know, you were sort of saying with your new MP who's kind of not part of the government, maybe you can have a discussion with him about like what's his view around an independent foreign policy. But really for us it's critical, isn't it, in terms of we have got to shift the direction from where we're going, which is sort of like catastrophic. And now's the time for a foreign policy that's based on peace, diplomacy, global cooperation. Let's spend the money saving lives, not destroying them.
Well, thank you very much, Sophie. You've covered an awful lot of subjects in record time. So uh, let's continue the discussions. I'd like to start by asking your views. Obviously, you mentioned Trump 357 times or whatever, not surprisingly. Um, uh, what fascinates me is that MAGA got into power. One of the reasons was that they said no more foreign interventions. Uh, and yet Trump, I think he's the latest count is, he's intervened now 7 different times since this second term. And yet, this latest intervention, it seems that only 1 in 4 of the American population is actually in favour of this. So, it's incredibly difficult to interpret or kind of come to any kind of logical conclusions about why he's actually doing this. Is this the last throes of what's an increasingly unpopular president? He kind of knows the numbers, and yet he and Hegseth and Rubio are kind of absolutely going gung ho, all out, as if this it genuinely is something that the American people want. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. He's totally sort of destroying his own base here, isn't he? And you know, but heaven forbid us to sort of like to be sort of concerned by the fact that like Trump might have lied when he said that he was going to be the president of peace. Because I mean, I think that in terms of what's going on globally, I feel that there is, I think the reason why there's this real urgency, I think that's what's going on, this real urgency and an acceleration of the US war drive in terms of, and also it's so reckless, like the sort of the tax on Venezuela and now in relation to Iran, is because the global dynamics are shifting, like they are shifting considerably and have been for some time. So this whole thing about the global economy, the US economy is now kind of basically sort of smaller. It's not as sort of powerful or as dynamic as China, for instance. So you have like the a lot of the global South economies are now kind of organizing and have been for some time, and are kind of cooperating. So, BRICS, sort of like Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. So that kind of alliance, economic alliance, which is, how can we kind of benefit in terms of, trade and global cooperation around climate action and all that kind of stuff. That's growing. I think it was just last year, for instance, Iran had joined that. That those economies have like surpassed the G7 economies. In fact, I think that happened, quite a few years ago. So you're seeing a real shift, aren't you, in terms of like, and that's a threat to the US dominance. And the US, I think, has a kind of model, and you see it kind of in all of its kind of military strategies. And this is made absolutely clear in the US national security strategy that was kind of published at the end of November, December time. It's laid out really clearly that the Trump administration is determined to reassert its global dominance, and it doesn't have the economic power anymore to kind of be using the carrot. Do you know what I mean? To be saying, we'll give you favorable like trade terms if you kind of come in with us. In fact, the opposite is happening, isn't it? It's like it's all stick, like I said. So it's like you're just gonna have to accept these sort of totally these kind of trade deals that are completely against your interests. And you're sort of seeing this with key kind of US allies, like, South Korea coming under, very, very, sort of severe pressure to agree it's a 350 billion pound investment plan, where the South Korea is investing all the money, but the US administration is determining where they invest in terms of like what industries. So this is all about like exploiting the sort of the technological advances of South Korea in relation to kind of AI and semiconductors, but all of the like 90% of the profit is going to be going into the US. So it's like, why on earth, would a country like sign an agreement like that where they're kind of handing over their kind of expertise and all their kind of investment to the US? But they are doing it because they are threatened by the US. You have all of that kind of military power at the US is kind of threatening there. So that's kind of what's going on. But I think that that's what's happening. And in relation to Iran, like, why is it gone for Iran now? Well, um, I suppose, it is in relation to Iran's, oil and gas reserves, but also its kind of economic and political alliances, with China and Russia and what have you, that the US is kind of wanting to kind of smash those up. I mean, others say that what this is about, and I'm not sure, but others say that like because Israel is such a critical ally to the US in the Middle East, that the US is prepared to go along with Israel. And so when Israel sabotaged the talks, the US was like, okay, I'll kind of go along with that. Israel clearly wants regime change in Iran, so the US goes along with that. I'm not totally sure myself, but I think there is this kind of this reckless kind of urgency of the US, which, as I say, is actually making the world far more dangerous. There's what are the interests, how the US population benefiting from this? They're kind of not, are they? Like this massive hike in kind of oil prices and energy prices. So I think, more and more we're kind of seeing a situation where this kind of approach of the US that we have got to, we like whatever it takes, even if it means that we're going to, end up in nuclear confrontation, we have to continue to be the dominant power. And I think that more and more countries are saying we don't accept this anymore. This is not what we want. We want a different world order, and that's kind of what Mark Carney was saying, wasn't it? He was sort of saying, the middle powers, as it were, we need to like have a sort of a separate block. So that's a long answer, but that's what I think.
Thank
I hope
you.
that's helpful.
No, thank you. The floor is open to questions. Either raise your hand physically like this, or use the hand raising thing on the on Zoom. Hi, Al, go ahead.
Thank you. Can you hear me all right?
Yep.
Yep.
Good. Thank you, Sophie. I'm enjoying listening to what you're saying. First of all, I now regard the US as a rogue state, essentially, along with Israel, has been for a long time. But secondly, we've noticed that Spain, the Spanish government, has stood up against Trump. Has any, which I applaud wholeheartedly, has any other government anywhere had the temerity to stand up to Trump to oppose this current outrage in the Middle East?
Yeah, no, you're right about Spain. I think it's very interesting because Spain also stood up to Trump around the military spending, didn't they? They said we're not going to increase our defense spending to 5%. And I mean, in terms of other countries that have kind of come out against this, I mean, it is a lot of the global South countries. Do you know what I mean? Like what I was just talking about in terms of those countries that don't want that clearly want a different way of organizing the world that's not dominated by the US. So yeah, as I say, most of the sort of the global South, most of the countries in Latin America, have come out against this. And those countries that like support and defend international law. So I must admit I haven't checked, but I'd be interested to know like where like Ireland is on this. I think there was maybe one or two Scandinavian countries that had come out condemning sort of the US attack. So it is there, but like it's there's a real kind of divide, isn't there, in terms of what parts of the world are kind of coming in behind Trump.
Thank you.
Al, did you see what Trump's reaction was to Spain digging their heels in?
No.
He simply threatened. He said, "We're going to stop all trade with Spain." He said,
Yeah.
"Yeah. You can't give the guy any credibility at all by even trying to rationalize it, I think." So, yeah, Helen, go ahead.
Yes, I did see something about that Spain was able to do that because they spent the last sort of 5 to 10 years building up their databases and things with companies outside of the US, whereas we're so closely linked with Palantir and all our databases, national databases, are all with US companies, and most of the servers are over there. And obviously we've seen recently we've seen a couple of new contracts given over to Palantir. Do you think that's a factor? And do you think, if the US wanted to be really, difficult, they could actually, close those databases down and prevent our access to our national databases?
I mean, they could do, couldn't they? Definitely. I mean, I think what's kind of, what Trump's wielding at the moment is the sort of the economic coercion, isn't it, in terms of sort of trade deals? But I mean, who knows how far Trump could go? But I mean, that's also another argument, like why it's so important for countries to be independent from the US and to have like a kind of diversity of trade partners, as well as like you know, defending their sovereignty. It's absolutely vital, isn't it? And I think that again, like, not to kind of harp on about Mark Carney, but like that's the point that he's making. Even, I think there's contradictions there, but he's sort of saying, we have to kind of defend our sovereignty. And in relation to, in fact, it was actually I think it was the former ambassador to Iran was talking about this and sort of saying that actually it's in Britain's interest to be kind of defending international law. For those countries that are not as like militarily powerful as the US, we definitely need to have like, a strong international law framework in order to defend our own sovereignty, because otherwise, we are going to be constantly under attack and and threatened all the time, economically as well as kind of militarily. So I think that a very, very strong point that we need to be making is reasserting the need for respect for international law. And the vast majority of countries in the world support that and want that too.
I'm going to throw in another question here. There's a strong argument for getting rid of NATO, and the Green Party, for example, it is one of their primary policies. Zach Polanski is very coherent in arguing for this. That they're the ones that are often causing the problems in terms of seeming to be aggressive. Certainly, you could argue that it was the NATO expansion that gave Putin the oxygen of publicity, if you like, and that allowed him to say what he does say now, that we are the aggressors and so on and so forth. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, I totally agree. And like, CND's had policy against NATO since 1960. And for the same reason, particularly in relation to this attack on sovereignty, but also in relation to how NATO sort of drives nuclear proliferation. So in terms of the sovereignty, I mean, we've basically signed over, all these military bases for the US to just do what they want with them. And so we know that like these bases have like been involved in committing war crimes and involved in illegal wars, and we don't have any say over that. But also in relation to economic sovereignty, I mean, being part of NATO means that we are coming under huge pressure, aren't we, to massively prioritize military spending over critical, health, education, public services, which are actually incredibly damaging to the security of our population, in terms of social deprivation, but also, having these military bases on our soil is also like puts us at massive risk, doesn't it? Because of the US, as we see, this reckless power, sort of aggressively attacking other countries. It means that, Britain is then a target, in such a war. So it basically sort of puts us on the front line. And, and it's arguable that we are legitimate targets because we are hosting sort of US bases. So that's, I think, really, really critical too. So yeah, I mean, this whole thing about like, being part of NATO it is for our safety and for our security and all that. I mean, it's just clearly, not the case at all. It's a sort of the total opposite. So, yeah, I think it's great. I think it's really great that the Green Party are debating this. And obviously they're coming under like a massive attack, aren't they? From the Labour government and the Tories on this. But it is a kind of really, really important debate to be having, and it's kind of it's fundamental to us being an independent state, isn't it? And like getting our sovereignty back. So yeah, we need to be kind of having that debate as widely as we possibly can. So I don't know if anybody here is like in the Green Party, and if you're going to the conference where it's going to be debated, but it'd be really good to hear your thoughts.
Anyone volunteering? Jenny, have you got your hand up? You need to unmute. You managed it before.
Yeah, right, done it.
Oh,
Yeah.
well done.
Yeah. I'm asking this question, Sophie, on behalf of Phil, my husband, and he says, how has Trump's administration damaged the UN, and do you see any future for the United Nations?
Well, I suppose it's damaged it in as far as it just disregards it, doesn't it? And it sort of uses its veto to block the implementation of international law in relation to Israel, in terms of, its sort of illegal occupation, but also in relation to, countries like Cuba, which have had this like, this horrific level of like economic sanctions against them, since sort of 57, that is now it's kind of collective punishment, isn't it? So yes, they kind of totally abuse the UN, abuse it, or just like now, I mean, what's going on with this board of peace, that's going to kind of govern Gaza. This is now being talked about, isn't it? It's like this is going to be the alternative to the UN, but like that's obscene. It's literally like, billionaires, isn't it? Like trillionaires just like paying to be on it. And like handpicked by Trump. So, how is that any, global representative body? It's just totally obscene. So I sort of feel like actually what's going on is a kind of reassertion of the UN as the body that actually is consistently like defending international law. I think you've seen this a lot in relation to the genocide against the Palestinian people, that it is the UN that's consistently kind of, speaking out against this, and exposing, sort of the US and Israel. But also how countries like South Africa are using like international law and like those institutions like the ICJ to to sort of expose that that illegality and those war crimes, and to sort of show the kind of the moral majority in the world that is opposed to opposed to what the US and Israel is doing. So I think there's actually been a kind of a reassertion and a kind of, I feel like a greater understanding of why the UN is so important, even though it's flawed. And I know there's lots of arguments in terms of how it's very kind of unrepresentative in terms of it doesn't sort of properly reflect the sort of the strength and power of the global South and what have you. But it's it's an absolute kind of critical body that we need to be championing. Yeah.
Thank you, Dave. Cousins.
Yeah, thanks. I was just gonna I think I don't know if anybody else was there, but I was at the 80th anniversary of the UN General Assembly in January in central London. And that was, I mean, it was a fantastic event, and hugely uplifting to see. I mean, I think just to go back to the question, I think the big impact on the UN from the US is cutting the funding. I mean, they are absolutely broke. They have no funding for almost anything at the moment. That's a huge impact, but it is changing. It does have this sort of UN 80 program of reform. They've got to wangle that through the Americans, but as Sophie's been saying, a lot of the rest of the world are hugely supportive of the UN and want it to continue. And I think, that's something we can all argue for. We can all debate. We can all champion. Join the UN association, be part of that, and get involved in the discussions about it. So I think. I don't think we have to do what Trump and Putin and Xi tell us to do. There's 8 billion of us in the world, so we do have some influence, hopefully. I would just sort of come back a little bit there on the relevance of NATO and whether it should exist or not. And I think as a matter of principle, sort of weaker countries, it's okay for them to band together in defensive alliances. I think that's a perfectly reasonable thing for sovereign states to do, particularly if they're sitting next to a more powerful one, a more powerful and aggressive one. So I don't think the idea of defensive alliances is a bad thing. I think part of the problem is that the definition of defense has got stretched and stretched and stretched, and so we get into preemptive defense, preemptive self-defense. And I think one of the many justifications behind the attack was that Iran was an imminent threat to the United States and therefore had to be taken out. I mean, I can't help but notice that it wasn't Iranian ship sitting off the United States. It was the other way around. So not quite sure how big a threat that was. And if that was the reason, then I think it really calls into discussion the whole concept of deterrence, because if the most powerful military and most expensive military in the world can't deter Iran, then deterrence clearly doesn't work. I just think there's a whole bunch of that's not even a comment. I'm not even sure where I'm going with that now. Just sort of a couple of reflections, really. But I would be hopeful. I think, as you say, there are more countries and more people that want the international rules-based order to continue, flawed as it is, in some form or other. And kings get deposed, wannabe kings get deposed. Even authoritarian dictators get binned as well eventually. So I'm more positive ultimately.
Thank you. Do you want to come back on that, Sophie? Are you?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it is how NATO is presented, that it's for those smaller kind of weaker countries to be kind of secure in the knowledge that there are these big countries that will kind of come to its rescue. But I think when you look at the reality of NATO, it's always actually been an aggressive and actually like a coercive alliance. I think if you just think about the pressure that has been put on NATO states to increase their military spending, despite the very like horrific impact it's having on our economies, and how it's actually meaning that most political leaders are massively unpopular. because they are enacting, these economic policies and are just, driving up the far right, which is deeply, deeply sort of threatening to all of us. So I think, just from that point of view, but also, like there was been, I feel that Ukraine has been treated so badly by NATO, in that there was so much pressure put on it to join NATO, to be part of NATO, and to call for NATO membership by the US, but also by Britain, knowing full well that this was a massive red line for Russia, that Russia is not going to accept having, US troops and sort of, nuclear weapons on its border. And yet NATO completely kind of pursued that. But when it came to okay, can we join now? No, so I think that I feel like that the Ukrainian population have been kind of treated as sort of pawns in a kind of a much in an absolutely kind of horrific kind of power play, and they are kind of they are sort of stuck in the middle, and I think that really, if you want a defense, something that really is genuinely defensive, you have to be kind of, this is CND, and the in discussions with this sort of the European peace movement, talks about this, the need to kind of move towards this kind of common security approach, where you have to look at the security interests of all of those countries within that region, and work out how you can bring that about so it's sustainable, and I think that having this kind of constant threat of US nuclear weapons, across Europe, I think has not been helpful at all. And in fact, Putin justified moving, nuclear weapons into Belarus on the basis that, there were, US nuclear weapons across Europe and in Britain. So I think that it's never, and as people have said, NATO invading and bombing Libya and Afghanistan, these were clearly not defensive actions. So I think it's really a very, very sort of dangerous alliance. And let's look at genuinely kind of defensive alliances and what they would look like. And I think that certainly a nuclear armed alliance that is the most powerful in the world is not a defensive one.
Yeah, I sort of I agree with a lot of that. I think it's moving from a view of security, or my security at your expense,
Yeah,
as
yeah,
to
exactly.
recognizing that security is relational and that I cannot be secure if you're not secure. And
Yeah,
therefore, actually, it's working together about how can we both feel secure. And it's that change of mindset that I think we
yeah,
need to try and get to.
yeah, totally.
But thanks.
Yeah. And I just think that what Trump is representing is the total opposite of that, isn't it? It's like we're totally happy to sort of, set the whole world on fire if we think it's in our interests.
Thoughts from
And
others?
sorry, should.
Go ahead, David. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just sort of slightly smiling as well at the way Trump was so rude about all of us and our defensive and defense capabilities and everything, and yet then suddenly he wants us and throws a hissy fit when we say no. I mean, I just it's pathetic, isn't it? Really, real childlike.
Mm, mm.
Yeah, no, David, I liked what you said about that it requires mutual security for anything to work. And I must say, I often think back to the early 90s when you had Gorbachev, Perestroika, Glasnost, and it was we were almost at the point of, and I'm being slightly playful here, but allowing Russia to join NATO. Yeah, it was almost as if that would have totally made the whole thing irrelevant. The Warsaw Pact would have become irrelevant, NATO would have become irrelevant, and we were almost at that point. And then suddenly, the real world took over again, and people wanted their power plays, and Sophie, you speculated on what exactly was the reason why Trump actually attacked Iran. My own personal view is that Marco Rubio let the cat out of the bag with his comment when he said, "Oh, well, we knew that Israel was going to attack them anyway, so we thought, my goodness, we better get in there fast, just to kind of protect our own interests and make it look as if we're part of this whole game or whatever it is." It is just this horrible, horrible game where there was one very interesting comment made by Jeremy Bowen this morning, which I felt really hit the nail on the head when he was also referring to the number of times that we compare Iran now with Iraq, for example, and we say, for goodness sake, have we not learnt the lessons from history and all the rest of it? But he did say, rather thoughtfully, he said there is a big difference here, that in the time of the Iraq invasion, which of course I was dead against, of course I was, at least there was this principle, this principle that didn't need to be said, that if you break something, then you also have to own it. Meaning, we bombed these countries back to the Stone Age, and then at least we also felt a little bit of responsibility of actually trying to fix the mess that we had created. And, therefore we stayed in Iraq for a long time or whatever it was. Now it's a very different game. It's as if Trump thinks it's okay to bomb a country back to the Stone Age and then say, well, okay, now we're going to back off and you own it. You own the mess. So there is this huge difference in what we're seeing now.
I mean, David's put in the chat, Libya is a better example. Do you want to say what you mean by that?
Just in terms of a comparison, I mean, I think in terms of sort of decapitating the leadership and then walking away, which is essentially what we did in Libya, is probably closer to what's happened so far in Iraq, and so that sort of and Libya clearly hasn't gone well since. And certainly some of the stuff I've been involved in, sort of meetings today and the last couple of days, the way it is spreading across the whole region in the Middle East is terrifying. I was part of an emergency response meeting today, and hearing our various country directors talking, the perspective there is very much that this is by far and away the biggest accumulation of military force and breadth than anything that has happened. It's bigger than the Gulf War, 1991. And the level of chaos in so many of those countries is immense and spreading. Israel has now told everyone south of the Litani in Lebanon to evacuate. That's 250,000 people. A lot of the humanitarian supplies were kept in Dubai. UN supply depots there, can't get at them. And weirdly, the most stable in the region at the moment is Syria, which isn't really saying very much. So it's there's real concern right the way across the region as to how this is spreading.
Sophie, you should know that David works for Tier Fund, so his reference to country meetings and all the rest of it is highly relevant here.
Yeah, I was going to ask. Yeah, no, definitely. It's just absolutely catastrophic. It really is. And and it's not like Iraq, is it? Like Iran is like double the size of Iraq. And I just, politically it's sort of very different as well, isn't it? I mean, certainly, like I think that Israel doesn't want to have another country in the Middle East that doesn't support it, you know. And it definitely is, and this is also the project of the Trump administration, a greater Israel. I mean, that's being talked about openly now, isn't it? You know, so I think that's kind of what this is about, isn't it? But not to end on terribly,
Come
but
on,
I
you've got
mean,
to end on a positive note.
no,
Yeah.
I mean, we have, haven't we? But we just have to keep going. We just totally have to keep going because, you know, the situation in Palestine, like in terms of that genocide, has been absolutely horrific. But like the movement that has come around that, you know, is absolutely extraordinary. And that is still very, very powerful. It's not going away. It's only kind of, you know, strengthening. And now it's kind of, you know, it's going to be getting bigger because we've now got this, you know, a horrific war opening up around Iran. And I think that, you know, more and more, you know, the reality is as the world is getting more and more dangerous, you're seeing a greater level of opposition to it. I mean, that's a reality. So as I say, you know, going back to those opinion polls, I mean, I think that's pretty, you know, that's something to be very hopeful about, the fact that there is so much opposition to this you know, to this attack on Iran in the situation where, you know, there's like, you know, a huge amount of like you know, opposition to the leadership of Iran. You know, there's huge issues around kind of Islamophobia and all this kind of stuff that's kind of whipped up around this. You know, Iran has sort of been, you know, part of the axis of evil for like decades, hasn't it? But nonetheless, people are saying this is, you know, this is totally unacceptable. You know, this is incredibly dangerous. It's up to the Iranian people, isn't it, to sort of, you know, to decide, you know, to just to determine their futures, isn't it? It's not you know, the sort of the genocidal nuclear armed, you know, Israels of the world doing it. So I think that things are definitely shifting. It's a very, very, you know, dangerous time, but like more and more people are sort of stepping up and saying, you know, I can't, you know, I just can't not, I can't do anything anymore. I can't do nothing anymore. I've got to do something about that, about this. And I think that that's what we're seeing now. We've got to kind of hold on to that. And it's not just, I think also more and more people are seeing the connectedness of all these crises, you know, and why we need to go and be working together. You know, this whole thing around the alliance that's forming against the rise of the far right, you know, that's very powerful. And again, it's kind of really important. So, you know, the more that we are working together, the more that we are understanding that our movements have the same objectives, you know, the same aims, that makes us stronger. So, and that's definitely kind of that's definitely happening more and more now. We will get there. We'll have to. We have to. We haven't got any other choice, have we?
Well, maybe we should end on that note, unless anyone has any other final questions. Well, Sophie, thanks ever so much for all your thoughts and covering so many different subjects. It's been incredibly stimulating, I think, and hopefully useful to the majority of us. Obviously, we're struggling slightly with what's happening, but as you say, we've just got to keep going and think positive. And do contact Jenny if you are interested in Saturday. That's quite important. There are some interesting links in the chat, so have a quick look at the chat. They do tend to disappear as soon as you, well, once you close the meeting, then that's it, the chats have gone. So have a look at them now before they do disappear. One new one has just appeared. There you go. We'll get there. Thank you, Dave. Moral arc of the universe is long, but it tends towards justice. I think that's the quote. Who by? Who's the quote by?
I think it was Martin Luther King, wasn't it? I think, but he could have taken it from somewhere else. Yeah. I'm not sure.
Yeah,
it's really powerful. That's really wonderful. I'm going to nick that.
Anyway, Sophie, thanks ever so much again. We really appreciate it.
It's lovely. I always really enjoy coming to these meetings because we always have such a great discussion. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Thanks. We'll close the meeting then. Thanks.
All right then. Lovely to see you all. See you soon. Take care. Bye.